strategy? Why do we need it? And how do we build a strategy? So as it relates to what, I'm sure each of us has in our mind's eye a definition of strategy. It may mean different things to different people. So what is strategy? We have a definition for you: a plan of action or policy designed to achieve or a major or overall aim. It's a noun in this definition. But Mike, I think you have a different take. Help us out.
Yes, Jane, I like to think of strategy as a verb because if done right with organizational alignment, it gets everyone moving in the right direction. But I've come across another definition that I think is more, that will resonate with many of the folks in this, on the webinar today. And that's this one, that every organization must find a combination of where to play and how to win that is appropriate, doable, and decisive for it within its unique context. This was penned by A.G. Lafley, former CEO of Procter & Gamble, and Roger Martin, the Dean of Rotman School of Business at U of T.
So we've now moved from noun to verb on our definition of strategy. Lucy, what would you like to add in your concept?
I like this Lafley Martin definition because I think it captures the notion of action. Make it clear that there are goals and you're trying to achieve those goals, that the goals need to be and the actions need to be appropriate, relevant. They need to be doable, something you can actually achieve. They need to be decisive. What I would take some issue with is the notion of winning and competitiveness is often an uncomfortable fit in the nonprofit sector. So I like to use the metaphor of the roadmap. And it has, again, all these elements, which I'll articulate here as understanding where you are now, where your starting place is, what your destination, your ultimate goal is going to be, that vision piece, and the route you're going to use to get there. And I find that language is more appealing in the nonprofit sector.
Thanks, Lucy. And it's a great metaphor. Before we move on, just to take a moment to welcome the fact that strategy is getting a lot of, what would we say, attention by a lot of different organizations now. McKinsey, BDC, the Business Development Corporation, Accenture, and speaking about such words as balance between short-term stakeholder needs, long-term sustainability. So this metaphor that includes a plan of action designed to achieve goals, being appropriate, doable, and decisive, helps us to move forward in our definition. So having developed what we consider to be a reasonable and appropriate definition in some large part to the topic of strategy, let's consider why. 3 areas are identified for us: focus, alignment, and impact. Let's start with focus. Lucy, what do you have to tell us about why you think strategy allows for focus for organizations?
Well, in my consulting work, what I've noticed is 2 main impulses when thinking about strategy. One is trying to be everything to everybody. And the second one is more of a problem where different parts of the organization will have different objectives. So I had a client not that long ago where this was a real problem because they had undertaken a merger, but they hadn't yet really integrated that strategy piece in the organization. So they didn't have focus. So of course, the problem there is that it exhausts your people because people are doing too much and they're in an unfocused way. You waste your resources, your finances, the time you have. And right now, especially right now during the pandemic, we really need to be stewarding those resources really carefully. Going back to your strategy, refocusing on your strategy is also a great way to know not only what to do, but also what not to do, which addresses my first point about trying to be everything to everybody. No nonprofit can do that. So going back with focus to your mission will really help your organization maintain those resources and increase your sustainability.
I can't agree with you more. It brings to mind a time in 2008, at the beginning of the 2008 meltdown, shall we respectfully call it, when I was with a client with a predetermined focus area. And I was told at the top of the morning that they had let go 20% of their workforce the day before. So we pivoted in the moment, and I asked the 30 leaders, senior leaders in the room with me, what do your people need from you right now? And after they thought about it for some time, I'll never forget the 5 things. I'll tell you the first one on the list. It was this: people need to know what is expected of them right now. So it was laser focus, exactly as presented by you. Lucy, Mike, what would you add?
Well, as a board member of our hospital foundation, we are all focused on raising capital to support the hospital. Our president and CEO has passion for the strategic direction that she helped the board create. She executes against that strategy with resolve. Each year, she sits down with her staff and develops tactics and actions that focuses on the strategy and gets us closer to the objective. The staff report to the board quarterly, outlining their achievements. They all appreciate the focus that the strategy choices bring to their daily efforts to raise funds for our hospital. And that's going to need to be strengthened as we hope to be raising funds for a new hospital in the next 4 years.
Right. So focus does exactly that. It helps us to know where to focus our attention and our resources. Next is alignment. And we've got a metaphor that's associated with alignment. I know Lucy has something to tell us about that, but Mike, why don't you start? What does alignment mean to you as it relates to strategy?
So when you're developing a strategy, debating amongst yourselves and making those tough choices for an organization, it's a very good team building exercise for any leadership group. The alignment that comes from that exercise is very powerful when the organization sees leadership acting as one unit focused on a specific or a couple of specific outcomes. There will be ups and downs through the process, none greater than what we've just experienced with the pandemic. But I would encourage you, once your agency is stabilized, to relook at the strategy and revise or recommit to the objectives you developed pre-pandemic and get that focus back.
Great advice. Thanks, Mike. And you, Lucy, what about your metaphor?
I think, having everyone align with the strategy obviously is going to make your organization more efficient and effective. It takes some work to make sure that everyone knows and understands the strategy. I think in nonprofits, it's especially important that all volunteers know the strategy, and it's not just something that the staff work on. Volunteers are often your best ambassadors, and whether they're serving at the board level or delivering Meals on Wheels, that communications that they can forward about the strategy is really important. Another point I'd like to make about strategy and alignment particularly is it's dynamic. It's not static. You will have people with different experiences and different ideas throughout your organization. And you want that because you want that richness of opinion, that richness of information. But you need to harness the dynamics so that you can use it to respond to changes in the environment and changes in your organization. And again, I love a metaphor. The one that I think resonates for me is the idea of rowing. And we all know that you can have the best athletes in the world in your boat, but without the coxswain keeping coordination and direction, adjusting for the current and the wind, your team's not going to cross the line first. So I think that alignment really helps move your strategy forward. It's a huge benefit.
I would agree. And one of the boards I sit on just last week, I had an experience where the board itself was not aligned. And one committee spoke on behalf of the board, which did not capture all the views of the board. And it really eroded, at least for a short period of time, the feeling of not only unity, but also trust between board members and the people they serve. So alignment has very high stakes in terms of the positive outcomes that it can create. And conversely can have very negative impacts if all our stakeholder groups are not aligned with respect to strategy and how we action it. Brings us to the third element, which is impact. Mike, tell us what you know about dashboards and measurement.
So for each stakeholder group, a well-executed strategy will turn the frowns into smiles very quickly. Making the right choices should have immediate impact on your results. It's important that we measure and set goals for each objective that we choose to focus on. Showing progress at the end, towards the end state, will create positive energy in any organization. More people will get involved, and the work that is not adding any value will be questioned and eliminated to allow more focus on the important task. Once this flywheel gets started and headed in the right direction, it is hard to stop the momentum that is created from the positive results that your strategy is delivering.
Thanks, Mike. I like the visual of the dashboard. In the work that I do in adult learning, we spend much of our time helping our clients understand the impact of the work that we've done. And better still, we like to build into the solution that which we will measure. So dashboards are very important in when we want to be able to not only measure our results, but also measure our return on investment and be able to move forward in a sustainable fashion to prove our longevity, to prove our value to stakeholders and our clients. Lucy, what would you add to impact?
Well, I'm in agreement that you have to be able to measure your efforts and know what's working and what's not working. And I think it's important also to go back to your mission as the touchstone for your strategy. As Mike said, a good strategy is going to have an immediate positive impact on your mission. It also may mean that you have to make some hard choices as you're developing and operationalizing your strategy, because you want to make sure that strategy is having the greatest possible impact. It's another tool that you can also use for talking to your funders and your donors and other stakeholders about how their contributions are adding to the impact of your organization. During this pandemic, most organizations have had to make some really tough decisions, keep staff, lay them off, pivot programs so they can be delivered within the pandemic restrictions. Maybe think about mergers because surviving through this pandemic seems unlikely. Spend your reserves or save your reserves. All these decisions are being made in order to sustain ourselves. So as we're thinking about post-pandemic operations, it's a good time also to be going back and looking at what is our intended impact, tweak our strategies as they're needed to be tweaked, and our actions. Sorry, that's what I'm meaning to say, because we want to continue to remain sustainable and keep being able to push our mission forward.
Thanks, Lucy. And I think it's a great time just to pause at the close of the why part of our presentation before we move on to the how, to remind ourselves this, myself included. We want to ask ourselves, how relevant is our strategy? Does it need a refresh? Does it need a revisit? Or does it need a complete redo? And in the event that our strategy is working well, and we see here the confluence of focus, alignment, and impact, if those three things are working in unison and well balanced, we'll have a good solid strategy. We want the people that are among us, our stakeholders at all levels, to know what our strategy is, to know how well it is working, and to know what it means to them, how they can live it, how they can action it, if that is their role within the organization, or if their role is to oversee, as with the board, we would like them to know, how well we're doing that. And also for all stakeholder groups, as Lucy has said, funders and the community at large. So let's pivot now to how. And there are any numbers of ways for us to move forward to develop a strategy, but let's start with number one, and that is Mike.
So many people, when they're developing a strategy, the first thing that they do is assess their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This process focuses on an internal review first. And there's some talk and literature out there that says maybe it would be smarter to do the environmental scan first and understand the external pressures before we look at the organizational strengths and weaknesses. In our view, to complete a comprehensive environmental scan, we must look at political, economical, social, technologies, environment, and legal impacts that the organization faces. Given this knowledge, then you will be in a better position to make the decisions on what strategy will be for your organization once you've collected some more data. Lucy?
Another important set of information you want to gather up is knowing your stakeholders. And you want to involve as many stakeholder groups as you can possibly involve. The research, all the research shows that the greater the diversity of input you have on any question, and that includes strategy, the higher quality your decision-making will be. So most organizations will start with their boards. Their boards are their important volunteers, they're important decision makers, they're very committed to the organization, and they'll have lots of insight. But you can't really stop there. You need to also involve your clients and staff. They have firsthand knowledge of your programs and services. They know whether they're effective or not. Staff at all levels have this kind of expertise, not just the leadership. So I would say one of your important stakeholder groups are actually your frontline staff. They will often have information about new trends or new challenges that haven't yet moved up to the executive leadership. Community is an important, that's a very broad stakeholder group, but in there I would put sister organizations, local business leaders, political decision makers, funders, of course, donors. They'll all have different points of view to add to the richness of the information you have. The last piece is the hardest piece, which is try to find the people you don't know. Try to find those people who are not on your mailing list. Pre-pandemic, I've had clients who have put surveys and invitations to surveys in public libraries and other community settings like that. I've conducted focus groups in cultural centers, identified by the client as people they didn't already know and didn't already serve. So you want to try and get that missing piece. It's hard, but it's not impossible. And post-pandemic, of course, it's going to be easier.
Thanks, Lucy. I couldn't agree with you more. In the school that I ran for the first 17 weeks of COVID, they're in a very successful, impeccable organization as it is. The push was to invite a more diverse group of students to join the organization. And that is very germane to any organization right now. I'm sure we can see that as we progress. How they pushed that opportunity was through social media, through tweets and Instagram, and pushing through media appearances. And it worked very well for them. So you want to be able to use as many different resources in order to attract people who may not know about you, as you said, Lucy. Not always an easy thing to do. Gathering internal data. Mike, help us to know what you would like us to know more about in that regard.
So this is where we start to focus internal. We've talked a couple of steps that we think are very important to understand the external pressures, but now we need to gather data internally and information from our employees in terms of what they are interested in doing, what things they want to do, what things they think they should be doing. And also, as Lucy mentioned, it overlaps with knowing what your clients feel about the programs and the services that you provide. Collecting this data is critical, and that information will give you more knowledge to help you know how big the gap is versus your organization's mission and mandate, and that will help guide your strategic choices.
And Lucy, making decisions.
Right. So if you've been thorough in your information gathering, you're going to have a lot of data and a lot of opinions at hand. And it can seem overwhelming if you've done the work well. So this is one place where it's particularly useful to have an experienced, trained facilitator to help you winnow this information out, provide objective analysis so you can make sense of it all. If someone on your board or staff has the expertise to take on that role, that's great. I would make the point that the best practice is to have them step back from the decision-making so they can focus on the facilitation of the process. So what is that facilitation? 5 steps: creating a straightforward and effective process for your organization, highlighting the critical information, pulling it out from that mass of data that you have, ensuring that all your voices are heard and you're not falling into a kind of false consensus situation. And sorry, I merged two there. So ensuring all voices are heard for better decisions and avoiding fake consensus, and then focus your decision-making on strategy. It's very tempting, and as a board member, I've been guilty of this myself. It's very tempting to get into action and tactics. Don't do that if you're on the board. Leave that for staff. That's their area of expertise. Focus on the strategy. I'll add one note for these pandemic times. Over the years, we've made strategy on very long timelines, and they've been naturally getting shorter anyway, moving from 5 and recently to 3 years. Right now, during the pandemic, when things are changing on a daily basis, 6 months may be a very long timeline for your organization. If your environment is in total flux, as it is if you're in education or healthcare, 6 months may even be too long, and you may want to do 3-month timelines. The length of your strategy timeline is a lot less important than keeping it dynamic and being responsive to what's actually happening out there on the ground.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree with you more, Lucy. Thank you so much. And I think, again, it speaks to the 2 points that you've made. One, having an external facilitator can be very helpful, even when you have one in your midst on a board or on the executive committee. It allows the individual who would be facilitating in that event to actually be a part of the process. But I can't say strongly enough how important it is, particularly in making decisions, that there be a process that people understand and know. In other words, here is how we will make decisions. Here is the protocol or the process that we use. There are many ways out, many methodologies that are available in order to help with decision making, and usually it will be your facilitator who can help move the process along, and, as you've said, Lucy, make sense out of all this information that you and your stakeholders have been able to gather. Mike, last topic here: determine who has responsibility. Can you tell us what this means for you?
So traditionally, boards have governance and oversight for the organization. Their mandate is to ensure that staff have the resources to sustain the business. A key resource for any group is a good strategy, but the board alone cannot expect to come up with the strategy on their own. As we've mentioned many times throughout this discussion, it's important to have an inclusive process where input is heard, data is collected, and then collectively, if possible, decisions are made as to where to play and how you will succeed.
I'm going to follow up on Mike's point with maybe a little bit of pushback here about what's the tradition around who has responsibility. The legal requirements for boards are actually really minimal, and a lot of the responsibilities that we now think of as board responsibilities, those have built up over time. Some of them have become tradition or best practice. But out there in the world, we're in the middle of this incredible monumental set of changes. We've got the pandemic, which we've talked about. We've also got Black Lives Matters and Me Too movements coming back to the forefront. We have a belated and thankfully growing recognition that our organizations have not always been inclusive. There's lots of populations out there who just don't see themselves either being served or serving through our organizations. The donor-centric versus community-centric fundraising debate, that's shifting a lot of thinking in that subsector of the nonprofit world. And of course, we've had the We Charity scandal, and there's still lots of fallout coming from that. So all these things have been sort of rocking, if I can use that expression, rocking the nonprofit world. One response to all these kinds of movements around inclusivity and diversity in our organizations are to also experiment with the governance models that we're using in the sector. I'm aware of a few projects. One I want to highlight is what's going on at the Ontario Nonprofit Network and their Reimagining Governance project. So these are my words, not theirs, but the project in part recognizes that for some boards, they have the least knowledge and expertise about what's happening in the communities that their organizations are meant to serve. So if that's the case, I think it's worth asking ourselves, why would we let that body have responsibility for setting the strategy for the organization? So it's something that I think we need to think about as we move forward as a sector. And I'll close this thought with asking the question, if is the best practice of letting the board set strategic directions really the best one-size-fits-all solution? Or are there others out there that we should be exploring?